Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're super excited about this session, Killing Performance Reviews, Becoming an Agile Org. This is a topic that I am really excited about. Everybody hates performance reviews and we still do them. So why? We're going to talk about sort of the context of what's happening in the world and how this impacts how we think about employee performance, the limiting factors of typical performance review cycles, and what good performance progression promotion cycle can look like. I am Barb. I'm the founder and CEO at Pando. I'm joined today by Jason Medley, the Chief People Officer at Codility, a friend of mine. We were just kind of trying to figure out how long we've known each other, and we decided, I think, about 8.5, 9 years. We've been working together in some form within the people community over that time. Jason is, as I mentioned, head of people at Codility. Codility is also in the talent space. It's the #1 rated technical interview platform. Basically helps teams test for the coding and skills of developers and make evidence-based hiring decisions. They have about 1,500 plus businesses using the platform across 70 countries. The team itself is also distributed across Europe as well as the US. Jason's role as Chief People Officer is really getting to solve and kind of tackle some unique talent challenges with the companies they're working with, as well as, of course, their own. He's been in many different people operator roles and head of people roles in New York, in San Francisco, now this kind of Europe, US model. So super excited to have you, Jason. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm excited for this conversation. I, too, hate the performance review, so excited to go deep on this.
All right, so we're just going to dive right in. I think as we've been sort of discussing this topic, I would say even between you and me, probably over the last 12 months to a year. And of course, we're doing this session now, so we get to totally nerd out on it. But I think it would be great to kind of get your perspective on what are some of the current trends and the shifts that we've been seeing that impact how companies should be thinking about employee performance and career growth. I talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the event. There's been a lot of external things happening. And so what are you seeing in terms of current context around what's actually impacting the way that we think about employee performance, progression, et cetera?
Yeah, I love this question, because I think if you would have asked me this question a few years ago, the answer would have been different, right? It's hard to think about any talent practices or programs or anything we put in place without thinking now through the context of the pandemic and what we've come through. And I think as organizations, as people, as we've all kind of gone through this time and we're still going through it, we've all kind of reset, or we've been resetting, and we've been thinking about what's important. And one of the things that's extremely clear that talent wants, we see this in data, we see this in many organizations, is that people want more authenticity at work. They want more realness, pardon my language, but they're tired of the bullshit, right? And our systems and our programs need to reflect that. It needs to reflect the sort of transparency and the equity that people want. I was just at, and just to make this hyper aware, I was just at a program at Stanford University a couple of weeks ago. It's sort of their classic executive program that they put on. I was in a cohort of about 60 execs from all over the world and organizations of different sizes. And two things were really interesting there on this topic. One was Stanford's actually started implementing authentic leadership training, because they've seen in their own data how important this is. And what we really mean by that is vulnerability and risk-taking and just being real and transparent and meeting the needs of our people. And then two, this was a common theme amongst all the leaders there. They were saying our talents, they want more out of us. They want more realness. Like, we're finding ourselves exposing ourselves as leaders and talking about our lives and the impact of what we do in a more real way. And as we had this conversation, what became clear was, oh, like, it's very clear that that it's not just something that we talk about, but we need to take a look at all of our programs and all of our processes. And so when we think about talent management, this is clearly a place. And when we think about performance management and performance systems, this is clearly a place where I think is absolutely been lacking authenticity and sort of authentic relationships inside of those programs. And so this is something that if you're a talent leader or a people leader, you cannot operate nowadays without wearing these lenses, or any leader inside of any organization, because if you're not being authentic, if you're not being real, if you're not being fair, your talent is literally going to walk out the door.
Right.
They're tired of what once was, and they're demanding this now moving forward.
Yeah. I actually like what you were saying about leaders being authentic and also really truly being vulnerable is one of the reasons that I started a company. Like, obviously, we're trying to solve a problem that I care deeply about, but also I've been in so many situations where, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about being vulnerable. We're talking about how that basis really creates a trust environment to help you, operate and perform better as a team and as a company. But so many times, at least in my career, I've just been bitten in the ass by it. Like, I am being vulnerable, and then it gets turned around and used against me. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that I've been focused on as a founder also, is just really building a company and creating that space for people within the organization and for myself to be vulnerable and to share and to be authentic. I do think it's really important, and I think it's an interesting context. And I also think it's related to the link between employees really caring about, again, like what the company cares about and what the company represents and the values of the company. And I think, interestingly, like back in the day, there used to be companies that were at the center of a community, and everybody in that town loved the company, and the company took care of the town. And then, of course, we took a turn and things happened, and that wasn't really the case anymore. But it's kind of going full circle that, like, we want our companies to be, and to create more purpose and to support, our community and our environment. And that means that leaders also have to be genuine and authentic in creating that.
Yeah, and most leaders aren't taught how to do this, right? It's not part of most management training programs. It's not modeled behavior from the top down, and it's certainly not in our systems and processes.
Well, it's not stuff
So,
that we've been like, all of the behaviors that are validated and supported and like reinforced are the opposite. Like, what we valued as leaders and business and all of that stuff is like very quickly changing also. So it's like we have to kind of start, I guess, first principles with how do we think about this stuff, and how are we going to address it now,
yeah,
right?
and it's certainly, as you're saying, that reminds me, we certainly weren't sitting in board meetings and your investors were going, "How authentic have you been?" Right? How real are you being with your people? How vulnerable have you been with your people the past year? Right? It
That's true.
wasn't a conversation that was happening, and a lot of times, what our talent is demanding of us, sometimes it hasn't caught up in our boardrooms as well. But this is a topic that's actually starting to get there, and it's really fun to see this happening in real time.
Yeah. I I think it's kind of happening more exponentially too, because I remember at Greenhouse, back in the day when we were bringing this whole concept of structured recruiting and, employee lifetime value and all of these important things, like we were making the people function more strategic by implementing these processes and tools that help them, be more strategic for the business. And we were, fantasizing about the day that the people problems were at the boardroom and were being talked about.
Mhm.
And I mean, even within VCs and funding and all that kind of scenarios, how engaged employees are, like, all of that kind of stuff are metrics that investors even have started caring about.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense in terms of like the current context at which we now are in terms of how we're thinking about employee performance, employee development. And so let's talk a little bit about how our current processes, how our current approaches really fall short of meeting talent where they are, and also where it breaks down, because I think this is like, when I think about performance management, it's this thing that if you ask any employee, even any manager or people team person, it's just like, ugh, it's a really bad process. It's a black box. It's full of, all kinds of crap. Everybody hates it. So like, why do we keep doing it? What are the things, and why is it kind of breaking down and falling short?
It's such a good question. And I saw, and while we answer that, maybe I saw that there's some folks asking, what does authentic mean, or how would we define that? And I think in the context of this, I can take the pass at that for sure. And one of the things that I think about when I say the word authentic, it's being real, it's being open, it's being vulnerable, being truthful, right? Like this is what we're seeing in a lot of the data that talent is giving nowadays, right? So they want leaders to not sort of hide behind. But to answer your question directly, so I think there's a few things in terms of where this is breaking down. So one is, I think that traditional performance reviews are extremely inequitable and just not transparent, right? So people don't really understand, and many, or really in most organizations, in my experience, in the work that I do now and the work that I've done at other organizations, they don't understand where they sort of sit at any given period of time. Like they don't know where they sit with their manager and their performance until they get to the review. And in many organizations that happens once or twice a year. And it's a surprise. Like you don't really know. It kind of feels like a flip of a coin. I'm going to have a really good review, or I'll have a bad review. And that isn't being transparent, right? And then on the equitable side, we see tons of biases involved. One of the biggest biases that we see is really this recency bias. So it's sort of what's happened in the last month or so versus what's happened over the whole extended period of a year. And this is a really huge problem when we're talking about fairness in performance management. And a lot of organizations will say, okay, we really separate our rewards and performance management, right? So we separate compensation from that. But when you really look under the hood and you dig in, it's not so truthful, right? Like we make compensation increases on performance, and we look at this data, like we have feelings based on this data, and it's just inequitable. It's not transparent. It's not real.
Not only that, but
go ahead.
Not only that, but I think the whole how we get to performance management comes from, typically companies are thinking about compensation bands or reevaluating compensation, and they're going and looking up data. They're building some leveling framework, or maybe they already have that. And then they just jump to, okay, now let's evaluate people like on these levels in the comp band that we have them in. And it's like, okay, well, that's great that everybody's in a level or in a comp band, but like, what are you basing that level on? What does that mean? What are the definitions? Do people understand what those things are? And how are you just jumping to evaluating them anyway without giving them context of expectations or the manager, et cetera? It's kind of like we're kind of missing the whole boat, really. And then it just perpetuates this process of, everybody's like, okay, the performance review is happening. This is what's going to impact my comp. And like you said, with recency bias, people start, I think that goes back to the authenticity thing. And you mentioned this in the prep call, is the reason this process isn't authentic is also because people's behavior actually changes. Like it's not their authentic behavior. It's not the way that they typically act or interact with their peers and their managers. They're coming and they're like, okay, especially at bigger companies, like, when the performance review process is, it's in September. So August, I'm going to start like, making friends with this guy over here, rubbing elbows, getting my projects, more
exactly right.
Whatever it is.
Every manager will start being more mindful of their one-on-ones. Are they structured right? Am I really leaning in with empathy? Am I listening to people? Am I showing up? Everyone changes their behavior. It just feels fake. It doesn't feel good. And not only that, let's be honest. The other thing is the operation side of it, it literally stalls organizations for a period of time, right? So most companies, especially companies in growth mode, they don't hit the deadline. They have to extend it. And it's just this thing that handicaps organizations, and people get really frustrated by it. So they don't believe in it. It's not fair. It's not equitable. And then the other huge thing I would say that I would call out is we're mixing up, like, I don't think we really understand what performance management is, to some of your points, right? We like, people want to grow. They want to learn. They want to see progress in their skill sets. And a conversation once or twice a year does not do that. We recently, so at Codility, we recently ran a survey of over 500 engineers. And there was a series of questions we asked, but two that stuck out to me is, one of the questions we asked is, what's most important when you're looking for a job? And the answer to this actually surprised me this time, but I think it's a sign of the times that we're in. The answer was actually money. But then we asked them the question, what's the number one reason you just left your most recent role? Or what's a reason why you're thinking about leaving your current company? And the number one answer was learning and development. I don't feel like I'm growing my skills. So that is the number one reason why people choose to walk out of organizations. We know this, and particularly in engineering, I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, I think, like, at startups, at least, I think there's a lot of leaning on, well, the company's changing, we're growing really fast, this creates opportunities, everybody has an opportunity to grow. And that is kind of like a big bias that we have as companies or leaders of startups, in that, like, yes, that's true. And that doesn't mean that we don't need the systems or process or structure to make sure that, like, that's validated by the employees, and also that they have, the opportunities. I think also from, like, an industry perspective, we've kind of rubber band around, like, we already found that we didn't think performance reviews really were the right approach, and that the problem was that we really needed this feedback culture, and we needed managers to give feedbacks. And so, performance reviews was kind of the way of, okay, there's going to be this time at endpoint. It's kind of an operational thing, but also a feedback and growth and development. Like, employees don't feel like it's growth and development. We say it is and think it is. But then it was like, okay, yeah, this process doesn't work. Let's just go to this continuous feedback model. And then that was great in sort of theory, but is everybody actually getting feedback? Some managers would do it, some managers wouldn't do it. And therefore you end up again with, like, nothing happening. So it's like, they're neither of those work. Like, we need to be thinking about, how do we bring people into the organization and then build paths to develop them? Because obviously, the more that an employee grows, the better impact they're going to have on the business. Of course, the growth and the business impact need to be sort of intertwined, but, like, we should be doing everything we can to unlock that growth and that potential with everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's more about, unfortunately, most people see it as, what box do I need to check to get my next increase? Let's all play the game so that we do this and we get these out of the way. See you next year, or see you in 6 months. And that's inauthentic. It's not working anymore, and talent are walking out the door over it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the bias also, like, we talked a little bit about recency bias. There's one thing that I'm really interested in is kind of rater bias, but also just, I spoke with a head of people yesterday, and he was like, yeah, this is something I'm guilty of myself, which is, if I have managers and also directors reporting to me, I tend to, like, have the same standard of how I'm evaluating them on a certain set of dimensions, which is not fair. Like, managers are earlier in their career, they're not at the director level, they're still developing, and yet you're comparing them to each other, like, because they all report to you, instead of comparing them to, like, an objective set of standards that should be aligned with their level or their role or whatever it is. So it's like, and that goes for 360 reviews and feedback from peers as well. Like, companies have implemented 360 to then have managers have more context into how, people see the peer, like how peers see the people that report to them or whatever, they're giving them the review. Here's your review. This is what we all think of you. But it's like they also don't know if the feedback they've been given is bias or not. They just like read it and then kind of like tie it up into a bow and say, you know, you're either getting promoted or maybe you're getting fired, or maybe everything's fine. I mean, who knows?
Well, most of those, if you think about them, they all ask the same type of questions, right? What are you doing good? What do you need to improve on? Continue, start, stop, right? Like that kind of type of thing. But it's not measuring against, it's not showing you, hey, this is what's actually expected of you at this level in the organization. Here are the competencies that are required of you in this role, and here's how you're progressing against them. And this is one of the things I really love about Pando. And I think Pando's done really well, because I haven't found another platform or product out there that really thinks about it this way in this much detail. And in that, when you're to your point, where it's very easy just to compare people on my team, regardless of levels or whatever, we're just doing that in our minds. But when we have a set of competencies at a given level and expectations and an understanding, we're able to more sort of thoughtfully evaluate them, and they're able to visually see how they're progressing against those competencies as well. So good recruiting, we do this right. We set up competencies and we're measuring against competencies, but somewhere along the line, it's like, as soon as you're onboarded, those competencies go away. And it's just like, oh, I think you're doing a good job, or you're not doing a good job, but we're no longer sort of evaluating against competencies, which we still need to be doing. And I think good performance management is doing that frequently and in real time.
I mean, it's kind of a bait and switch. Like, we bring employees in, we evaluate them on these skills, and then they come in and it's like pff, out the window. Nothing is connected anymore. Like what we brought you in for, what level you're at, how you're being evaluated, how you move through the organization, like it's not connected. Just hold on.
Yeah. I get excited. Imagine a world where, let's say you go into an organization, you spend 3 or 4 years there, and then you're transitioning out. Imagine if you can literally take with you sort of documentation of the skills and the competencies that you've actually improved in from when you first started, right? So when I first joined the organization, my skill set around these certain competencies, or where I was at, was here. Through these goals and these different projects I brought on, I was able to beef up my skills, and this is where I've come. Like, this is now part of my career story, and I'm able to speak to this more intelligently, and I can prove out what I've done and how I went from an IC to a manager to a director, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And talent, it's very difficult for talent to do that today, to sort of prove that out. And so it's no wonder that we're having a hard time evaluating fairly internally without having without measuring those competencies internally.
Yeah. I think the career path, as you just mentioned, is a really important point, and something that we're seeing more and more of in terms of having more steps. I mean, you need that structure. Obviously, we've talked a lot about that, but like having the structure then creates more steps. So there's more mobility, but it's also a matter of like having a manager path and having a separate and parallel individual contributor path or domain expert path that's really, goes as high, or maybe not as high, but pretty high in terms of how high can you go in the organization as an individual contributor. And also what I'll be really excited about, and we're starting to see this, is having more pay parity between, the individual track and the manager track, because it's not, one isn't better or worse, it's just different. And that's a big shift that we're seeing as well. But you can't really do that evaluation without having, all that structure built out. And you brought up something when we were talking before as well about the whole point that, like, once you make a certain amount of money, it doesn't, like, our performance management sort of paradigm now is, as you said at the beginning, it's tied to compensation. It's how we decide if people are getting more compensation or are not more compensation or whatever. But it's not just about compensation either, ironically. Like,
correct.
It needs to be tied together, but it's not just about that. Like, people want to grow, right? They want to develop.
Yeah, I think, most people want to know that they're being paid fairly and competitively, right? Like, they want to know that, and they want to understand that. And then, of course, there's a lot of data out there that says once you make a certain amount of money, it becomes it's sort of less of an impact over your overall life, right? And so, but ultimately, more talent than not, and what we see in like our core engagement indicators is this learning and growth. And we know this, like this data has been around for a long time, and the fact that organizations aren't taking it more seriously to measure it properly and to really help people improve is shocking to me. And so one of the things that I talk a lot about when I'm talking, to folks inside our organization and outside our organization is when we think about our jobs as managers, our first job, I think, is to help prepare them for what's next in their career, right? To help, knowing that could take them outside of our organization.
Yeah.
So when talent feels like you have their best interest at stake, when you're helping them improve their skills to get to the next level of performance for themselves, like that creates a lot more trust, a lot more feeling of authentic leadership. And honestly, it makes them want to work harder and be devoted to this purpose and this mission and this cause and to you as a leader. But also the other side of that is we're helping them be better so that the company can be better, right? Like the more skills our people have, the better they get, the better we are going after our goals, and we're going to grow as an organization. And we can do this. We can do this really well. Like we know we can do this.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue, I guess, into what does good or great actually look like? Like, what do we need to build in order to make our companies more healthy, more scalable? I mean, I think for me, the benefit of like rethinking this whole process is that the system becomes more fair, the company becomes more productive, people actually grow. We don't leave that like untapped potential on the table. So what are the things that we need to do to like recreate this system or this paradigm? Like, what does that actually look like?
Yeah. So first I'll say, we need systems and frameworks that grow with us and are agile. And so, I assume today in our audience, we have a lot of talent leaders here, a lot of people leaders. And one thing I know about a lot of talent leaders is we really like our documentations and our processes, and we put a lot of work into that. We put a lot of thought into that. And sometimes the idea of breaking that or restarting or iterating on that seems burdensome, and it's a lot of work. But the reality is, like, we need these systems and frameworks that grow with us and are agile and are flexible. So when we think about like agile methodologies, which I love, it's a really interesting topic, particularly when you think about product development, of course. But there's really sort of two values there that I think about a lot. So two of the core values around agile methodologies are, working software over comprehensive documentation. So we as HR folks spend a lot of time documenting a lot of stuff, part because we legally need to, but also because we feel like that's the right thing to do. The problem is, like, people get lost in that, right? We need good, transparent systems and processes. The second one that I really love is, and many of you probably know this if you studied this, it's responding to change over following a plan. So essentially continuous improvement, being iterative, right? So we have to change our mindset within the talent space to experiment and be iterative. Like everything, and I know that it impacts people, and we get a lot of pushback when things go wrong. But if you think about it in the context of product development, like they're not spending all their time waiting to be perfect before they ship, right? They're shipping, they're taking some feedback, and they're iterating. And we can experiment and do that. One of my favorite groups to experiment with is engineering, because they're so honest. They give you the feedback. They see the holes that you'll never see, and I love that. So I think that's one thing.
Opinions.
Yes, exactly. Another big thing I would say is just, these programs need to be continuous, transparent, and structured. So when we say continuous, and I saw a couple questions around this, particularly when we talk about feedback and, performance management in general, this is it's a process. It's an action. It's always happening. It's not one conversation a year or two conversations a year. It's always happening. So our talent and everyone here, we all deserve feedback all the time. In fact, that's the only way that we get better, right? And so we need systems and platforms that allow us to request feedback and to receive it and give it at any time, at the beginning and kickoff of a project, in the middle of a project, at the end of a project, right? Because that's how we get better, and that's how we get signals earlier. And quite frankly, that's how our organizations get unblocked and we learn about these things before it's too late. Like we've all heard stories, or we've been part of this ourselves, where we walk into a performance management review and we hear some feedback for the first time, and we're so surprised by it, but evidently it's been a well-known thing. The
Yeah.
manager's known about it clearly for a long time. They've been waiting for this moment to tell me, they've been waiting for 8 months to tell me this thing. And it's like, if you would have told me this 8 months ago and coached me through it, like we could have been a lot further by now. Right. And so I think
It also creates like this culture of, you're going to start dismissing people, like their behavior hasn't changed, but you haven't given them an opportunity to change their behavior. It's not, again, authentically caring about whether or not the person is growing, because you're like hiding behind this performance review process, and then you give them the feedback, and it's like, okay, well, now you already resent me for doing this for the last 8 months.
True. And listen, what I think we all know about people is we're not very good at delivering feedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't grow up learning how to do this really well. We don't grow up in school and receiving feedback, right? As soon as we hear the word feedback, our walls go up, our brain kicks in, and we're sort of, we're very much sort of defending ourselves, and we're making sure that no harm is going to come to us. And it's not, when we just rely on people to do it, it doesn't work. This is where we absolutely need technology to help us, and there's good technology out there, Pando being one of them, right? This is why we've adopted it, because it gives us the opportunity in real time and frequently to ask and receive feedback, so that when we are
way too, I think, is what you were kind of getting at earlier, yes, like around the types of projects or the competencies or in your level or whatever it is.
Yes. And so when we're thinking about a promotion, for example, right? So we go back into Pando, we go back into the platform, and we look and say, okay, have they started to create a culture of feedback around them? Are they taking growth into their own hands? And by the way, I think really great performance management allows people to take growth into their own hands. It's very transparent. It gives them the tools to be successful. And one of the things that we've done at Codility that's been really successful is really our promotion packets that we have the individual contributor initiate first. So we do this in parallel with Pando, and they're able to pull in the feedback that they've had. They pull out their main competencies, how they've grown against those. And as we've done this, what we realized is people have started using this tool. People have started opting out of requesting a promotion because they realized, I'm actually not ready yet. I actually need to still beef up this skill a little bit, right? And any talent leader in here, if you're a people business partner, an HRBP, or a manager, this is one of the most frustrating things when someone comes to you and they're like, I want to be promoted, I'm ready to be promoted, and you're like, you're not ready yet. Like you're like, your skills aren't there yet, right? And to be able for them to self-discover this themselves in their own growth story and to see this beautifully in a platform is huge. And so,
it's a huge shift, because I think, I've talked to a lot of people leaders and company leaders. And when you talk about this concept of like continuous progression, or even bottoms up, as you've mentioned, like where it's really coming from the employee and the manager and not like some cyclical process, it helps to know that, like, if you have the structure, if you have the right context, people will make the right choice. It's not, you don't have to worry like, oh, because we're doing this now, employees are going to think they can progress every 6 months. It's like, well, no, because now they actually have the clarity, the transparency around what the expectations are, and they can actually self-evaluate and understand where do they have deltas, where do they actually need to grow. But if we don't do that for them, if we don't give them the context, if we don't say this is what the expectations are, then of course they're just going to want to keep going and think that they're ready to go. Like, we have to provide that structure and that context.
It's true. And I also think they have to believe that it's fair across the organization, right? So, anyone who's worked in any side of organization knows that on some teams, it's harder to grow and get promoted or get more money, however you want to look about it or think about it, or to get access to projects to beef up your skills. And then it seems like on other teams, it's super easy. like they're promoting constantly, like they're just running up the ladder, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And I think when we go back specifically to the topic of competencies, like the number of competencies that's required to sort of increase to sort of increase on as you're gaining skills is important, that's equitable across the company, right? So I think through good structure, which is another piece of this, transparent structure, so that people believe that it's fair, that it's equitable across the organization in terms of promotions, that everyone who's actually a director is truly a director, everyone who's an IC7 is truly an IC7. Now, the competencies could look a little bit different depending on the function, but ultimately we all believe that we're sort of playing within the same structure, and that it's transparent, and that it's clear. And today, I would say most organizations, you can't honestly say that there is that fairness throughout the organization.
Yeah, you'll have people in one team like looking at another team saying those people have career progression and they keep moving and nobody gets promoted in our team or whatever. And it is true that without that consistent structure, it's like most likely isn't fair. Maybe you have some good managers who are really focused on coaching and developing their teams, and that's a correlation, but like that should be consistent across the organization.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that we have a couple of kind of pointers, I think, for everyone in terms of how to actually make this work. We had a question around solution. I think we talked a little bit about that. I would say like doing competency-based performance is much more concrete, much more contextualized for individuals in terms of what are the actual dimensions that you need to be performing at and mastering, and how are you performing at and mastering those. I think introducing competency-based frameworks with feedback and feedback culture, and really like focusing on the stuff that you were saying, Jason, that this needs to be an ongoing conversation, an ongoing thing, an iterative thing. Like you're going to be working on different things at different times, and how are you kind of moving the needle across those dimensions? But what are some of the other things that need to happen? I think with Codility, I know there was a little bit of a cultural shift that was necessary. Like, how do you think about getting buy-in for this type of thing? What do you need to do with managers or executives or employees to really kind of get this approach adopted?
Yeah. So I will say, so we're in an organization where we're spread out globally, right? So culturally, sometimes some of these topics are just different depending on where you're at in the world as well. One of the words that I've learned that works really well globally is the word fair. Equitable doesn't always translate very well, or some cultures think that that's an American or a Western problem or UK problem, right?
Or about
and
stop.
so we use the word. So I use the word fair, and most people in most cultures can relate to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good starting place. But like any program that you roll out, you want to get early buy-in. And one of the things that we did was, even as we were thinking about this shift, is we brought a cohort of people in from sort of different levels, different functions, and brought them in on what we were trying to do. We were explaining the problem. I think most people could relate to the problem, and we actually had them evaluate the tool that we chose, which happened to be Pando, but to really think through the competency piece. And as we did that, we got more buy-in pretty quickly. I will say that, when you start out on this journey of being competency based, so we had the one thing that was worked in our favor is we actually interview against competency. So not every organization does that. If you're not doing that, I strongly encourage you to do it, to have standardized processes around competencies. But the same competencies that we measure for people in the interview process, we knew that we wanted to do that in terms of performance as well. And so what we did, another way to sort of get buy-in, is that we had teams work together to create these competencies. So one, we reviewed the ones that we were already recruiting for, but we thought about some that we weren't actually seeing. And so it became sort of a very integrated, very cohesive and collaborative process where everyone sort of got to weigh in on, hey, how am I being evaluated? What are these competencies? Do I agree with this? And actually, for the most part, the process was really great. I mean, we've had to do this at the executive team as well. The executive team had to go, What do we want to be evaluated against? What do we believe are the true competencies of a really great exec?
Yeah.
How do we want them showing up for the organization? How do they lead? What does that look like? And now I'm measured against these things,
Yeah.
right? And
I think
so
it's great that you
things
guys did that executive rubric. I think I haven't seen that done many places yet, but it's really good to, in terms of setting the example, you're all leading by example as leaders, also operating in that framework. And as you said, you're now, held up to a standard against those competencies, but also you want to grow, right? Just
yeah,
because you're an executive doesn't mean you're done.
most execs, right? Like you reach a certain level and it's like, well, they've kind of mastered everything and you may get some feedback, but it's like, no, that's not true. First of all, no company is created equal. Just because you have the word exec or you have a C in front of your name or whatever, doesn't mean that you're on the same management and leadership journey as others, right? And going back to the past few years, there's been zero playbook for what we all just went through. And
Yeah.
even the idea of being vulnerable and being authentic was something that wasn't on anyone's radar in terms of something that we measure or think about, and certainly in terms of a competency. So yes, things do evolve and change. The macro environment changes and requires different skill sets of us as leaders. And so again, systems that are agile and are flexible and that aren't over architected to the point where you can't keep up with the change of the world is a problem. And unfortunately, a lot of our processes in our organizations are, or it's just what we've always done.
Yeah. What about, I just have one last question. I think we answered the ones that are coming from the group and we can stick around obviously after, but what about metrics? Like if you're moving away from a traditional performance cycle and this is sort of like a cultural shift, what are some of the metrics or measures that kind of validate? Like, what are you trying to get out of that?
Well, I think one, of course, you can always measure just how people are feeling about something, right? So I think that you can do that. But if you back out, I think there's a couple of other things that I like. One is we started this idea of this growth, like this sort of growth metric, right? So
Yeah.
like so Pando, the platform that we're in, we're able to see actually the rate of of the organization growing, right?
Yeah.
And so we're able to go, okay, are we actually leveling up our skills as a company, right? Are we getting better as an organization in terms of our skill set and being able to measure that? And I think that is critical. The other thing that platforms like this, when you're focused on competencies, pull out is you're actually able to see across the organization which competencies are we the strongest in and where are we the weakest. This comes out very, very clearly. So when you're thinking about where do you spend your L&D dollars, like you actually have the data to go, okay, we're not as strong in communication in this certain area, or we're not as strong in maybe feedback, right? And so we need to invest there. And this is why I need the dollars to do that, because we've already gotten buy-in on the competencies that make us all successful. And now we're able to show where we're sort of weaker and how we sort of level up. So that's one thing. And then again, of course, in your normal engagement surveys and the things that you do, we know that growth and L&D are core indicators of engagement, and you'll be able to see that metric very clear there as well.
And also just I think if you're using Culture Amp or whatever survey you're using, there's always the question about do you feel like you have career growth? Is that a real thing here? And that's always something that we hear that companies are struggling with to improve. So I think that's definitely an easy way to sort of benchmark where you're at and where you're trying to get to. The employee growth score and sort of velocity of growth. And I think the other thing is just the amount, the pipeline of diverse talent, because you've created this more fair, more transparent, more on-demand system, are you getting more diverse senior level ICs as well as managers kind of in the organization? Well, that was fun. Thank you so much, Jason, for all of your insights and for having this conversation. I think it's a really important topic. I think it's really exciting, the shifts that you all are making at Codility and kind of what we're seeing more broadly. Really appreciate you spending
Thank
time
you
with
so
us.
much. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
All right, well, we'll hop off and we'll be available in the chat if anybody wants to ask us any additional questions. Up next, in a few minutes, we will have hiring from non-traditional backgrounds. We've got a great panel going to be exploring approaches to how do you find talent, how do you recruit them and bring them in from non-traditional backgrounds, but also what are the cultural sort of implications within the organization to support and adopt that. So stay tuned. We'll be back with that shortly.